Hi everyone, I'm Stan from Eagle Vision. I'm here with Ben Payne from Payne Advisory Group. Ben, welcome.
Thanks, mate. Typically, by going for that larger side, we're assuming that they're going to need to access a lot more capital, and again, capital outside of their own network and their own funds. So then we start looking at what are the options then in terms of capital raising, and then also what are the legal requirements for you to be able to go on capital raise. So first of all, we'll talk about wholesale funds.
Yep.
And in talking about wholesale funds, we'll talk about wholesale investors and the requirements for someone to be able to access those type of funds and be qualified as a wholesale investor. So the first type of wholesale investor is a sophisticated investor.
Right.
So, and again, there's generally three, there's actually a few more categories, but there's generally three main types of wholesale investors when it comes to property development activities. With that sophisticated investor, they've also got to prove that they've had a gross income over the last 2 financial years of greater than $250,000.
No.
Or they've got gross assets outside of their family home of more than $2.5 million.
Right.
Now, for those last two requirements, they need an accountant to sign off on a certificate to verify that that information is correct for them to be considered a wholesale investor and for them to be able to invest into a wholesale fund. Not so much in terms of how many, like you can actually, as a wholesale perspective, you can essentially capital raise as much as you want.
Okay.
There'll be a limitation on the number of investors up to a certain point, depending on the type of vehicle that you're using to do your capital raise.
Yep.
So say, for example, if you were capital raising under a company, you may tip over into being a public company based on the number of shareholders that you might have. But if we're talking about a fund or a unit trust structure, then typically there is no specific limit in regards to how many investors you can bring on or quantum of value. So outside sophisticated, you've also got the professional investor. Professional investors are other AFSL license holders, some publicly listed companies, super funds, and when they refer to super funds, they refer to the trustees of the funds. And there's also some other organisations that may be in control of more than $10 million of gross assets. So those professional investors will just automatically qualify as wholesale investors. Outside of that, and probably not the most commonly one used, is an experienced investor.
Okay.
So an experienced investor is someone who can demonstrate that they've actually had experience in those type of investments before in the past. Right. So commonly, if we're talking about property development, if they've done their own property developments before in the past, even in the small scale ones, then they can sign a declaration form to advise that, in the past you've conducted this activity. I understand the risks associated with these type of developments, and essentially through making those declarations, they can actually still qualify as a wholesale investor, despite not meeting those other two categories that we mentioned before.
Okay, understand.
So a wholesale investor, and once they qualify for a wholesale investor, it means that your disclosure requirements aren't as onerous as dealing with a retail investor, which we'll talk about later on. So essentially, there is no formal requirement in terms of what information you have to present to them.
Right, okay.
It's just assumed that whatever information that you do present to a wholesale investor, that they're educated enough to expect and digest the information, and to be able to make their own decision and their own inquiries in regards to whether or not that's a good investment opportunity for them to invest into.
Right. Okay.
So from that wholesale perspective, that's technically how you get around disclosure related issues. But even despite the fact that you may not have to do those disclosures, it may not get you around the requirements for you to still have an AFSL, to be able to deal and to be able to make the offering to those investors. And the reason is because of our system with ASIC is quite complicated, and there's a number of different areas depending on whether you're dealing with a trust, which might fall under a managed investment scheme, or if you're operating under and you're doing your developments under a company structure. There's different requirements under each one of those. Right. And essentially, the hardest thing is that if you're trying to bring an investor on board and if you're trying to demonstrate the merits of that particular investment, by having a lot of those conversations, create documents that's talking about the merits of your project, may actually then require you to have an AFSL to deal with those wholesale investors. It'll be a limited AFSL, regardless of the fact that they are a wholesale investor.
Okay.
So that's where a lot of people get trapped, is that they think, I've got a wholesale investor, I don't need a license. But more commonly than not, and particularly with property development transactions, if you're promoting out your opportunity to wholesale investors, then commonly, and you're having discussions around the investor,
Having that.
most commonly you will require that AFSL license.
Right.
And if you don't have it, you're in breach of the asset regulation. Not a lot of developers actually make that progression.
Right, okay.
And it's because the step up in compliance, the ongoing reporting, and even the initial investor documents and everything else that have to put together creates a whole lot more cost structures that you need within your business to be able to just to perform that function.
Sure.
So commonly, most developers just steer clear of it altogether. So first of all, what is a retail fund? What is a retail investor? A retail fund is basically a fund that attracts retail investors.
Okay.
A retail investor,
Like raising capital for the ASX or something like that.
correct.
Right, okay.
So, and then it doesn't necessarily have to be through the ASX. You can still do it as an unlisted.
Okay.
But it's the types of investors that you're going to be attracting.
Okay.
So retail investors, basically all the explanations that we went through before and the definitions about wholesale investors, the retail, everybody else is essentially the bucket that they all go into. So, then, as I said before, there's all kinds of then complications about dealing with them. The greatest benefit is cost and expectation.
Okay.
So, sorry, I should revert back. Not cost. Expectation of returns.
Right.
Is mainly the main benefit, and the level of investment. So you can attract a lot.
$20,000 in.
20 could be $1,000.
Right. Okay.
You can actually specify the minimum investment amount.
Okay.
But they don't have to qualify. Like anything for a wholesale investor, so anyone can come into your project. So
And then they're expecting 15, 20, 30% returns.
correct.
Right.
A wholesale investor in property development is typically expecting a return somewhere between about 8 to 12%.
Right, okay.
So that sounds quite attractive in comparison to with a wholesale investor. That would be, again, depending on the type of project, how de-risked it is and everything else, minimum they'll be looking at is 15 and normally north of 20, 25%, etc. was what they'll invest for a wholesale investor.
Yeah, okay, sure.
As we mentioned before, quite complicated in the retail space, and the majority of the audience probably wouldn't be entertaining to go down that path. So let's just focus on wholesales.
Yep.
In regards to wholesale, there still is going to be a requirement for you to be able to attain a license. There's going to be a requirement that you've got the expertise to actually run a wholesale fund. So you've got to have past experience in actually either being a corporate authorised representative, or a responsible manager, or some kind of significant role within a wholesale fund in the past, for you to be entertained, to be qualified enough to be operating your own wholesale investment activity under an AFSL.
Right.
So quite often, a lot of developers, when they're first starting out, don't qualify.
Right.
So initially, when they first start out, a lot of developers need to partner in with somebody that does have an AFSL and then provides those services, the trustee services, the fund administration services,
Communication.
and potentially a fund management services. So they actually provide that for the developer, and it is a much lower cost option. It's a lot easier to obviously create that relationship with the trustee to get to that point. So you're not waiting also years trying to get your license in place.
Yeah.
Saying that, if you're a developer and you're doing a number of projects, that cost becomes quite expensive over time, because every project you do, you're going to be incurring those costs. So there's a balancing point where you maybe after a couple of years of operating with another trustee, and you're being a corporate authorised representative under their license, And once you get up to operating a number of projects, then it's probably that ends up being the tipping point to maybe when you start looking at actually operating your own AFSL. Not really. It just comes down to demonstration and your knowledge, and also the team that you've got around you, the team of advisors that you're using, accountants, lawyers, and also within your internal team, what other funds management experience anybody else has got within there. So it's going to come down to your team. And also, again, as we were saying before, even with scaling developments, and we're talking about, the size of development that would actually warrant a wholesale investment. Even if you're going to use somebody else's license to be able to conduct those particular developments, there's going to be a whole lot of costs that you haven't had before in the past of your projects that you're going to need to now account for. So generally, unless you're looking to raise at least $5 million in capital, then generally we find that it's not worthwhile to go down that path, and that you really need to build up to projects of that scale. So the biggest problem we've got is, before we mentioned, small scale offerings tap out $2 million. Wholesale offerings don't make financial sense. Sometimes they do, but not always make financial sense unless you're doing at least a $5 million capital raise.
Okay, understand. Next time round, we'll actually talk about some of the communication documents for running these kind of projects. Thank you for watching.